Hello and welcome. My name is Victor Mendoza. I'm a Principal Solution Architect at Talis, and what I'd like to do for this presentation is share with you some of the reasons why security is failing, but more specifically, why is it that our critical data and critical information continues to be compromised even when it has been encrypted. Let's first start by understanding what are some of the security challenges we face today. The basis of the slide hopefully shouldn't shock anybody here. Most of us recognize that the volume, variety, and the velocity of data continues to grow, with the global data volume expected to reach 175 zettabytes by the year 2025. The other thing that is growing is the number of regulations and compliance mandates to protect the privacy of our personal and financial data around the world. PwC reported that there are now more than 1,800 regulations around the world, and for multinational organizations, managing this complexity is becoming a major challenge. Another challenge we face today is the number of cybersecurity tools that companies are deploying inside their environments. In another recent IBM report, it found that on average, businesses are using more than 50 different cybersecurity tools, which has created a sprawl of solutions and silos around the data security processes, as well as the integration and communication between teams. And lastly, with the pandemic creating a global world crisis, it also created a cyber crisis. During the months of March, April, and May of 2020, many companies, in order to continue to operate and survive, they had to expose critical systems that were previously only accessible from inside their network, and also support a remote workforce. Whether they realize it or not, instead of closing offices, they opened up hundreds and even thousands of new remote offices. Every single home is now a remote office that has access, control, and management to their data. This is a huge problem because before the pandemic, we were able to control and manage what came in and out of our network. And also, we were able to do inventory of all the devices that were connected to the network. Now that our employees are working at their home office, there's very little infrastructure security in place to protect them and the data they are managing. All this has increased the attack surface and the number of vulnerabilities, which has led to more data breaches. About every day, we hear about these data breaches in the news, how they continue to occur, and the impact it has on the company. If companies are spending time, energy, and efforts in trying to address a problem, why are they still being broken into, and why is it that their critical data continues to be compromised? If you look at all the major companies that have suffered a major data breach, they all had security policies, they all had user awareness, they all had firewalls, they all had logging and monitoring, they all had incident and event management, they all had a security budget, they all had security teams, they all claim to be PCI or HIPAA compliant, and yet they've all gotten breached. And the problem I see is this: while they're doing good things trying to prevent, detect, and respond to a cyber incident, they're not focused on the right things that really matter. So, what I like to do next is focus on what are some of those important things that a company needs to focus on to mitigate the risks of having their most critical data and critical information from being compromised and disclosed. The first, and probably the number one reason we see these data breaches, is because of lack of awareness. Everything in security starts with having an up-to-date network diagram, having full visibility into all the systems that are connected to the network. If you don't have an up-to-date network diagram because it's too hard or too complicated, how can we make the claim on the overall security of our systems and data? Because you also can't protect what you don't know, which is why we must get full visibility and awareness into our environments. This means having complete asset inventory and being able to verify and validate every asset in our network. Now, every company and organization is different. Some of them only have to verify, validate, and protect a few hundred servers, while others have thousands, tens of thousands, and even hundreds of thousands of systems, which can be a very daunting task if they're starting from scratch. So the question I get sometimes is, where should I start? What are the systems I should verify, validate, and protect first? Now, I like to start with systems that are accessible from the internet for a couple reasons. If they're accessible from the internet, then they have an IP address. And if they have an IP address, then I can scan them. And if I can scan them, then I can verify and validate them. The other two reasons I like to start with systems that are accessible from the internet is because the number of external versus internal systems should be less, and because these are the systems that have the highest risk of being compromised. Once we have full visibility and awareness into all of our external systems, the next thing is to make sure that we have configuration and vulnerability management. This includes making sure these systems are up to date and patched within a reasonable time frame. If you can't patch a system within 30 or 60 days, then these systems are probably not worthy enough to be connected to the internet. Patch management continues to be one of the best defense measures against external malicious actors because you can't exploit a vulnerability if there's no vulnerability to exploit. And the vast majority of breaches today are due to unpatched systems, which is why it is important to have configuration and vulnerability management. Next, we need to go beyond usernames and passwords and make sure that we enable multi-factor authentication for any external system accessible from the internet. The most common approach to MFA includes asking an additional security question or using an out-of-band one-time password by sending a verification code to the user over a text, so SMS, over email, or even a push request to their mobile phone. However, the best MFA method is to use the FIDO, the Fast Identity Online Alliance standard, for strong cryptographic authentication called UTF, or Universal Second Factor. Now, the technical details are beyond the scope of this talk, but in simple terms, this specification leverages asymmetric cryptographic keys to securely authenticate and validate the identity of the user. It also helps mitigate the risks against real-time replay attacks as a common way to bypass MFA. Now, the last thing we need to make sure is that for any external system, they should never contain any critical data or critical information. Never, ever, ever. Now, how do we know if these systems contain critical data or critical information? The answer is, you don't. This is where we need to scan these systems using data discovery tools, and we need to do it on a continuous basis. If it turns out that we discover critical data or critical information on any external system, then we must assess the risk based on the volume and the variety of the data to determine if we need to disconnect the systems from the internet, move the data off these servers to servers only accessible from the inside our network, or to protect the data using encryption. Now, all that sounds simple enough and straightforward, but for some reason, companies are still being broken into and the data is still being compromised. For all the breaches where we have seen 100, 200, or even 500 million records compromised, in each of these scenarios, the data was encrypted. And so, we have to wonder, why is that? What are they missing or doing wrong? And well, it turns out that while they are encrypting the data, it wasn't properly encrypted and controlled. So let's dig more into this and understand why. The first reason encryption fails is because of poor cryptographic key generation. In order to encrypt our data properly, we must first make sure that the cryptographic keys are generated in a way that is complex enough, non-repeatable, and we do it in a way that is defensible. At the heart of this is randomness. Now, humans are terrible at randomness, and machines only do what we tell them to do. The good news is that we have specifications that are compliant under the NIST Federal Information Processing Standard that uses a deterministic pseudo-random number generator that uses enough entropy to generate cryptographic keys that are unique enough. And when I talk about doing it in a way that is defensible, I don't want to make it seem that we are paranoid, but more about making sure that we're cautious of the process by having a dedicated system where we remove any wireless communication from it. So making sure that there's no Wi-Fi, that there's no Bluetooth, nor sound, or even a microphone. And basically, anything we can use to communicate with that system other than the screen, we want to remove. Because what we're trying to do is limit the external influence that can come in during the process of generating these keys, and also hide any information for how the keys were generated. Today, we use HSMs, or hardware security modules, that are a specialized and trusted network device that is responsible for performing critical cryptographic operations, including the key generation, the key storage, and the key protection, by making sure the keys never leave and stay inside the boundary of the device. The next point is less about why our critical data and information is getting compromised, and more about determining if we're going to suffer a major data breach or a minor data breach. The difference between a major and a minor data breach is the amount of critical data that is compromised. And so, when it comes to encrypting our data, we want to make sure that we don't use the same key for everything. While this sounds like common sense, it's not always common practice. Imagine if we were told when we checked in at the hotel that if we lost our room key, we could just ask any of our neighbors to open the door because all the rooms share the same key. You would think that they were crazy and most likely reconsider staying at the hotel. So, if it's something we wouldn't do in the real world, then we shouldn't do it in cyberspace. And for those that are focused on taking a zero trust approach, instead of using a single key to encrypt an entire database that might contain, let's say, 500,000 records, we would use a single key per record. That way, if a single key gets compromised, instead of exposing 500,000 records, we only expose a single record. Now, even when we have strong cryptographic keys that we can use to encrypt our data, and we remember not to use the same key for everything, why is it that critical data and critical information continues to be compromised? Is it because the adversary now has more supercomputer power than the NSA? Have they been able to break AES in a timely manner that is also cost effective? Because if the data was properly encrypted, and if it was compromised, they shouldn't be able to get access to the information, right? Well, the reason we continue to see data be compromised, even after encrypting our data, is because companies are failing at key management. So, the first rule to key management we need to remember is that we should never store the cryptographic keys with the encrypted data. That's like leaving the key in the lock or under the doormat of our front door. You can have the best, robust, super duper lock in the planet, but if someone gets access to your key, game over. So, you always want to make sure that as your first rule to key management is to store the cryptographic keys on a separate server and are never stored with the encrypted data. So now, if the systems gets breached and the data gets compromised, yes, they have access to the encrypted data, but they don't have access to the keys, and therefore, they can't decrypt the information. The next reason critical data and critical information continues to be compromised, even when we remember to store our cryptographic keys on a separate server, and this is something you want to make sure that you implement as part of your key management strategy, is because they didn't have any separation of duties defined. Separation of duties is a security model that is meant to segregate the duties of your IT administrators that are responsible for managing the systems or the data store from the security team imposing security controls to protect the data. A lot of enterprise databases today offer something that is called TDE, Transparent Database Encryption, as a feature to protect the data. The problem with TDE is that we're now giving our database administrators full privileges to not only manage the data, but also manage the keys that are used to encrypt the data. So, the question I have for you is, how much do you trust your DBAs from not walking away with the encrypted data and the cryptographic keys? Now, the last reason critical data and critical information continues to be compromised, even when we generate keys that are complex enough, we don't use the same key for everything. We store our keys on a separate system and we enforce separation of duties, is because even after going through all this efforts, for some reason, we decide to leave the door open and grant everyone access to both the data and the keys. Encryption without access controls is pointless. So whenever we encrypt our data, we need to make sure that we also limit access to only those users and processes that need access to the data. At Talos, we're working on a new feature for our transparent encryption agent that will allow you to send another MFA signal request to the user before accessing the data. This is a separate request from the initial MFA request to access the system, which adds another layer of defense from having your most critical data and information from being compromised. This next slide is more of a bonus. Once we properly protect and control access to our data, the next thing to do is to measure our security. In other words, what is the 5 nines of security for encryption and key management? Now, I've been thinking about this since the early days when I started to do data security. And while there are many metrics that we can look for, because the solution we are implementing is focused on prevention, being able to control, reduce, and limit access to our critical data from unauthorized access, we want to look at a metric that is not a long-term metric such as uptime, but more of a visibility metric, which is the number of attempted attacks or the number of times users and processes are being denied access to our data. Why? Because it is a positive metric, it shows what you're stopping, and it also raises awareness. Now, this only works if at a minimum you follow the last rule, which is around limiting access to those that only need it. And if you have a security team that is focused on doing threat hunting, this is a great metric to look at because it could indicate initial signs of a system being compromised that you might have missed in the early phases of the kill chain. Now you're probably thinking, Victor, this is sort of back to the basics. And you're right, there's nothing revolutionary or anything crazy here. This is all good standard common sense practices. The only difference is that instead of taking a device-centric approach, we are now taking a data-centric approach. The problem today is that there are over 1,500 different cybersecurity vendors that are all promising the holy grail to security, when in fact, the solutions are right in front of us. We just have to discover, verify, validate, and understand what is in our environment and how to protect against it. The fundamentals that I cover is 1, making sure that you have full asset inventory because you can't protect what you don't know. 2, making sure you have configuration and vulnerability management because you can't exploit a system if a vulnerability doesn't exist. 3rd, go beyond usernames and passwords by enabling multi-factor authentication. And lastly, being able to discover, protect, and control access to our data. At Talos, we provide a unified data security platform that simplifies the management of access, data discovery, data protection, and control to your most critical data and critical information. If you'd like to learn more about our platform, visit us at the URL shown on the screen. Thank you.